I think of you as like a connector. And I see you on LinkedIn networking with a variety of types of people. And that's something that I put off for a long time, like in my entrepreneur journey and podcast journey, is like the importance of like relationships and networking. So like, because for me, I feel like it was a little bit challenging to do that, or I didn't know where to start. Is that something that like you've always had in you, or did you have to teach yourself how to do that? Tell me a little bit about like your philosophy with that, and how you view connecting and building relationships with people.
Yeah, I mean, the answer is it's innate in me. It goes back to the playground school days, where you're like, how do I bring in all the different groups of people that are on the playground? It's like, whether to classify the cliques, like, all right, you got the nerds, the jocks, the cheerleaders, like all of these. I'm like, but we're all just humans. We're all just people at the end of the day. And so like, I was friends with everyone. Like my best friend always made fun of me. It's like, you would love to walk down the school and just like say hey to everyone. I'm like, yeah, because like I like everyone. Like even if you don't like them, like you don't know where those things are going to go. Like there's no point in bullying. Like there's just the insecurity. So yeah, it just goes back to who I was as a kid, of how do I bring different groups together. And it's just kind of gravitated towards the ethos of life is about time and relationships. Being in a revenue role for me, for most of my career, it's always been like, all right, well, I'm trying to sell, but like, I don't know if my product is going to be a fit, but I know you're going to change jobs. I'm going to change jobs. Like no one stays in their jobs. We're not like our parents who stay there and get the Rolex watch and graduate and all that fun stuff. I'm like, no, like, I don't know where this conversation is going to go. So you're a good person. Fine. We can't work together now. Who knows where our relationships will take us? But maybe I know someone that you may find valuable. I'm like, all right, let me connect, and like, let's just be connectors. So it's truly just been who I've been. And it's just served me in the terms of like, I don't know what I don't know. So let's go curious, which is one of the values I live with in my life, is like curiosity. And then how do we just bring good people together and see where it takes you?
I love that, because I agree, but it's taken me, I think, just a little longer to realize that, or how to go about it if I am kind of pitching or someone's pitching. And I don't know, I always just looked at it as this like transactional thing, but I guess you're right. It's like whether or not we work together or what I'm doing fits with what you're doing, we might as well enjoy the ride, get to know each other. If you seem like a cool person, yeah, let's chat, let's keep in touch. And like you said, you never know where it could go. I guess it just seems like some people kind of struggle with that, and maybe I'm just speaking about myself. It wasn't until maybe like a year and a half ago when I started this podcast, and I found like a group of like online people that I started connecting with, and now we meet every Friday in like a quote unquote like mastermind. It's more of kind of like a hangout, but I really have realized just those like 6-7 people, it really has just made an impact on me and my journey for podcasting, but also just in life in general.
I mean, it truly is, but you also have to think about beyond transaction, right? Like
it's hard for some people, maybe.
Well, it is, because you're like, I'm in this space. This is the box. This is a lane. And if you aren't in those lanes, then I'm not going to be able to talk to you. But the problem is, and science has proved this, you think about the instance where someone goes from a completely different industry to a new industry, and they change everything. Why? Because they came in with a fresh perspective. They thought of things that the rest of everyone with their blinders on, of like, this is just the way we do things. But all of a sudden you're like, well, I don't know how you used to do it, but this doesn't make sense, so let's think outside of the box. And that's the same way to think about relationships. It's like, I don't know what you know, and I don't know what you teach me could lead to in the future. So like, maybe you tell me, I don't know, that your hobby is sewing. And I'm like, oh, well, I know 3 people that have podcasts on sewing. Like, have you listened to those? And you're like, no. And I'm like, so had you not connected, had you not even told me about this sewing passion, I could never gone down this path of like just random connections. You don't know. But too often we focus on, what do I want to say before I say it? What do I think I can get out of this before I actually get it? And that becomes a limiting belief in that regards, which what I believe.
Yeah, it's funny, the thinking about like what you want to say or what you how to like introduce the conversation. But yeah, if you more just try to like be in the moment, it tends to flow more naturally. So piggybacking on that, as far as like podcast growth, because I know you do some of this and you have done some of this, but like, so what's the best way for like a podcaster to network? Like, you don't want to just go up and like talk about your show and I got this like, does anyone give a shit about your show? But then you're over there like a podcast movement, you want to like talk to people about your show to try to like get something from them. Well, I guess what's the best way to like in person to like talk about your podcast in like a way where you don't sound so like desperate, you know?
Well, I guess, what are you trying to achieve? So the example you're throwing in is like, you want to talk about your show. Why? Why do you want to talk about your show? Because you're hoping that they listen to your show. And so why do they want to listen to your show, right? Like, what is the exchange here? Like, I want to talk about my show because hopefully you listen to my show or you find my show interesting. But like, you don't even know if they care about what you do and who you are. Like, so just starting the networking of things, like if you're at a podcast event, this is what I love about the podcast community is like everyone has vulnerable, honest conversations. And it's like, hey, you're in podcasting. Like, what tools do you use? That's always my favorite question. Like, what tools do you use? Right? And then you start geeking out over like, oh, you do this, well, I do that. Like, hold on, what's your show? Right? Now you can have a natural lead in of like, hold on, you clearly have a podcast. So what tools do you use? I don't care what the podcast is, but we're now just geeking out about tools and how long have you got into it? You're really, at least for me, the questions I love is like, how did you get into podcasting and what tools do you use? Those are so generic, but they get to the core of like how someone got into it and what is the system that they've started playing around with it. Those things then have nothing to do with your show, nothing to do with networking, nothing to do with listen to me. It's not a me thing. It's more of like, how do we connect? And then once you've got that connection, now you're like, all right, where do we take this? You go like, oh, you use Riverside. Well, I use this. What made you choose Riverside? And then you can go like, well, because my show, this is the kind of conversations I'm having. I'm like, oh, you now just told me what your show is about. All right, it's a give to get. So you've kind of given me that kind of insight. So now, well, this is why I use, whatever service I use. So you're literally able to pull back that layer. It's no different than you're a podcaster. And you're like, what questions do I ask? Same thing in a networking expanse.
We, not me. I like that. But tell me a little bit about your how you got into the podcasting, the business side of things. Would love to hear a little bit of your story as far as sales and revenue generating and development. Let's hear a little bit about that.
There you go. You're picking up in exactly how I network with people. Like, how'd you get into it? So, yeah, I mean, I love that piece because I got into podcasting. I was at a company. We got acquired by CBS Radio. And going from a startup to a large behemoth, it was an interesting shock in that regards. And one of the things that I really gravitated towards was the podcasting space as we're building that out. And so it allowed me to start selling host-read ads and understanding, what talent has to go through, what the brands have to go through, and make goods on host-read ads and everything else. And this was 2016, 2017. So this is a time where podcasting, at least for the radio companies, were still just kind of figure that piece out. One could argue they still are. But yeah, so got out of the media game because my background is in media. Got out of the media game and ended up at a company where we acquired apps. And one of the apps, three of the apps we acquired were in the podcast space: PlayerFM, Breaker, and Podkicker. Day one, boss is like, go figure this out. So when you're at a listening platform, you realize you have to go and work with the host. And the host, it's like, look, shows are hosted on your platform. We need to make sure that people can listen to them, whether it's Spotify, Apple, or in my case, the three that we had. So worked with the host to figure out what their needs were, who they were, what differentiated the host, but also how do we make sure that their shows are integrated into our platform. Once we did that, it was a matter of working with podcasters and saying like, hey, you have a show on our platform. How do I help you grow it? And then it was just connecting. Like, I would reach out to podcasters and say, look, you have a show. I want to help you grow it. And if there's 4 million shows out there, either you take my call or not. And if you take my call and you take the advice I'm giving you, perfect. If you're like, no, this doesn't make sense, great. There's 4 million other podcasts that we can help. And so it was from the networks to the indies, you name it. I was working with all different kind of podcasters to ultimately answer the three questions that every podcaster asks. How do I get more distribution? How do I grow my audience? And how do I monetize? And those are the three questions I hate. And
Not easy. There's not one right way to do it.
A, that's true. B, it goes back to the way I think about networking. Podcasters are thinking about an answer to those questions only from a podcast standpoint. The way I'm answering those questions is treating yourself as a brand. Stop focusing a person in a winner-take-all scenario of downloads. And once you get out of the mentality of you are having, here's the point, is everyone going to listen to your show and me and you talking right now? Like, no. But that's okay. They can go get your newsletter. They can read your social promotion. They can engage with your brand and what we're saying, and without having to sit here for 45 minutes consuming your podcast. And once podcasters start understanding that, you open yourself up to more ways to monetize, more ways to distribute, more ways to grow your audience besides just how do I get more listens? How do I grow my downloads? How do I get more people to know about my podcast? No, think about how I grow my brand. And that's really what I would kind of preach, even though I was running a platform where I needed to help you with listens.
Yeah, so kind of like looking at the whole ecosystem with like the podcast at the center, and then like you said, the newsletter, social, whatever. Maybe you have a service that you offer, and kind of it's all kind of one, but maybe the podcast it's just like a marketing piece of that.
It is a spoke. It is the content engine for your brand. But if we go back to the networking piece, and if I think about networking, I don't know where a conversation, I have no clue. Once you've hit record and you distribute the show, I have no clue who's going to listen to this in 3 years. Maybe you stop producing the show, but the show lives on unless you take it down from anywhere. I have no clue who's going to listen to this. Maybe 3 years from now, someone's like, I really liked Greg and what he had to say. Or maybe they really liked what Eric had to say and you were doing some other project. You don't know where someone's going to find you. So putting the content out there, pushing out the volume, not just hitting play and putting out a podcast, but going, I can put a blog, I can put something on my website. If you start thinking of yourself as a brand, and just like brand Greg is, life is about time and relationships. I don't know where this conversation is going to go. I don't know where this piece of content is going to go. So I'm going to put that post out there. I'm going to put that article out there. I'm going to put this content everywhere. And I don't know who's going to engage with it, who's going to see it. But I'm going to start tracking that. So if you start doing that, you get out of the how do I make money off of my podcast? And you have a better understanding of like, well, is it guesting? Is it tools? Is it clients? What are you trying to accomplish? And have an identity in that.
Yeah, I love that. And I think too, like, well, two things. I think obviously a show like this, it's very focused. And so, yeah, it's probably not going to ever get a million downloads or whatever it is. But then I think too, like, focusing on the audience you have, like you said, instead of, if you've got 1,000 dedicated, Pat Flynn calls them super fans. Yeah, like maybe you could monetize through them instead of trying to go so broad, that it almost feels unattainable, where you already have something, like you said, like branch out from there. And I think more people are starting to get that with smaller, like, niche shows like this, and repurposing the content and trying to grow a brand while you grow the podcast from all different angles. And I think you kind of have to look at it like that, unless you just have a massive audience and your show's big enough to get advertisers where you can go by like the CPM model and you're generating a lot of revenue. So I think that's a good piece of advice just for anyone listening, really.
I mean, two examples I like to go to just because most people know them is, let's go Joe Rogan. Let's talk about Joe,
sure.
Right?
I like Joe Rogan, yeah.
Where did Joe start? Joe started as a comic in the 80s
Comedy.
In New York, right? So think about, he had to consistently get on stage, get booed, get crickets, and work his craft. So if you are in the podcast space, are you working your craft? Are you working on putting content out there and just continuing? And then he played the long game, and now he's making $250 million. But where he started, right? So if you start your show small and you just keep growing, you put out consistent content, which most people don't because they stop after 3 or 10 episodes. So if you're putting that out, but you're also putting out all these other feelers with your blog, your newsletter, and everything else, that will then build your audience, builds your engagement, and allows you to become Maybe not a Joe Rogan, because that also comes with being good at your craft, and maybe not everyone's there, whether you say it. But then the other piece is he knows who his audience is. So he's not focused on, I won't listen to Joe Rogan. I love him as a comic, but listen to his show, it just doesn't do it for me. But I'm not his audience. He doesn't care. So if you understand who your niche is and who your audience is, you're going to talk to him. Most people are trying to go and be everything to everyone, and then you're nothing to no one.
Yeah. And I think it's a testament too, like with that, like patience and like consistency. Like, I mean, I've been in podcasting for a while, but I've only had this show coming up on 2 years. But yeah, it's that grind of consistency and patience and controlling. What did someone say the other day that I really liked? Oh, controlling the output, not the outcome. But if you're in the right place and you're being consistent, eventually, yeah, you might not get to 250 million, but good things will eventually slowly start to steamroll, and you'll build that momentum. And I think you just have to keep track of that and like the little wins along the way, so you don't get discouraged. But Greg, let's segue a little bit into AI, and AI specifically in the world of podcasting. And we're going to get into your role at Castmagic and the awesome things Castmagic is offering. But just initial thoughts, like AI in podcasting. Do you love it? Are you worried about it? Kind of what's your overall take on where it is now and where it's going to go?
I've got a biased view, as we know, because I work for an AI company. But
sure,
even before I worked at this company, when I left my last company, before I joined Castmagic, one thing I was trying to figure out is you got B2B podcasters. Take a B2B SaaS company, and they have a podcast part of their marketing mix. As a revenue generator, I didn't understand why my marketing team is always giving me case studies and white papers to go ahead and push out there. I'm like, no one wants to be going back to our networking conversation. They feel like they're being sold. Like that doesn't actually create trust, relationship, doesn't build it. But if you have Eric on your podcast for a SaaS company, and Eric is in a space that everyone wants to be associated with in that regards, like why wouldn't want to take a quote from Eric and go, hey, here's what Eric's saying, and then push that out there in either my email to my cold prospects or put it on my LinkedIn. I didn't understand why more people weren't doing that. Point of the story being is you can start thinking about podcasts and how AI is ultimately leveraged to get that message out there so much easier. So now I can go ahead and as a marketing department go, great, give me the top 10 quotes that Eric said. For me to do that, as you know, as a podcaster, it's a hard work to go ahead and try and mark, these are good quotes, these are good quotes. Let AI kind of pull that, gives you 10 quotes, great, let me pull things. Come up with the title. Do you want to sit here after this conversation and try and write a title? Do you want to write show notes? Do you want to write a newsletter? Do you want to write a blog? Do you want to write all these things? I mean, you know what it takes to produce a show, yet alone find a guest, air for 45 minutes, cut it down, and then do all those other pieces. AI is truly making the podcast space a better place because it is allowing most podcasters who are solopreneurs, or they're podcasting as a side thing, trying to make this their brand building, and they have a full-time job. How many hours do you actually put in it? So AI for the podcast space is incredible, and I'm all for it. AI overall has its downfalls, and everything just means you don't publish, you still read, you still consume what it's giving you, but I'd much rather, me personally, and I can speak to thousands of other people that feel the same way, they'd much rather have 20 pieces of content made for them, and then they can start using their brain and their strategy to edit and go like, this sounds good, I want to tweak this, as opposed to like, I got to use my brain power right now to come up with 20 pieces of content. I don't got time for that. I'm overwhelmed just thinking about that. So AI in the podcast space, game changer. Well, here to stay, and I'm all for it.
Yeah, no, I love it too. It definitely saves time, and then like you said, tweaking, using your brain to make things maybe sound a little more original or add some of your personality or the vibe of what you want written. It's funny, I remember I remember literally writing show notes. I would put markers when I would edit, and then when I would write the show notes after, I would go back and be like, okay, this episode is about XYZ, and they're talking about yada, yada, yada. It's so time consuming. And so, yeah, some of these AI tools are absolutely crushing it. I don't think I know anyone that's like kind of against it. I know people that maybe haven't like gone into it yet, but surely they will. But that leads us into Castmagic.
Actually,
go ahead.
I do know enough people that are against it for two reasons.
Okay.
One, I guess we can say, is ego. They're like, I can write better than AI can.
Yeah.
And two, hold on. First one is ego in that regards, and second one is it's kind of their job, and they're like, well, I don't want this. This is going to take my job. The problem with both of those people, it's ego and it's fear. So I guess if we go from that, technology, if you're fearful of technology, you're probably going to lose, because usually technology kind of ends up winning here. And if you are egotistical in the sense like, I can do a better job, then you aren't thinking about how AI is actually helping you, because you're looking at it as, I can do a better job. It's like, yeah, but could you use your brain power once again to not write 20 pieces, but actually come up with a starting point for you? And that's really going to help you. So I'd say to those two groups, give them a couple months, maybe a year, they'll make the switch. Otherwise, they're going to be behind.
Yeah, like the resistance to change, but like you said, they'll get there. They're going to have to get there. I mean, shit, I think whatever industries, even the ones that are like slower to adopt it or don't know how yet to like implement it, eventually that will happen. But it's funny for me, like I mentioned, manually writing the show notes. But now I do have a freelancer on my team that writes show notes for the shows that we produce. And she uses Castmagic actually. And I told her, I was like, yeah, like use it all you want, make sure you tweak a few things. But I can't imagine her having to write how many shows a week it is by hand. I mean, it has definitely improved her life, improved my life. So all for it. Stoked for it. Stoked to see where it's going to go, which we can talk a little bit about in a few minutes. But tell me about your role at Castmagic, how you got involved, and how things there have changed and grown, and kind of, the whole thing, what you're looking forward to there, and the tools. And for anyone that didn't know, tell them, that is a long-winded question, but tell them a little bit about Castmagic.
Yeah, so let's go back to networking. This is how it all starts. You don't know where you are going to go. So,
do you even have a resume, or do you just meet people and they hire you?
Right. That's how I've gotten most of my last few jobs. It's through LinkedIn. So I got this job because every Monday I post 3 podcasts on my LinkedIn that I think people should listen to. Happened to have done the show DTC Pod. At the time, the guys who then created Castmagic didn't even think of Castmagic. They hadn't even thought of the idea yet.
Okay.
Months later, because we then got connected, because I posted, we added each other on LinkedIn. They hit me up and like, hey, you seem to know a lot about podcasting, because I posted a lot about podcasting. Hit me up and like, we built this tool. Can we show you? Showed me Castmagic. I'm like, game changer. This is literally going back to my story about the SaaS companies. I'm like, this is what I've been trying to get podcasters to think. Think beyond the downloads, think beyond just audience growth with downloads, and think about how do you take this great, rich conversation and repurpose it. And that's literally what Castmagic does. So I came on board here April 1st. And so we're coming up, I'll date this, but we're coming up on a milestone in that regards. And then from what Castmagic does, so it originally started off as a podcast repurposing platform. So the guys have a podcast. They were paying an agency to do it for them. And they're like, we could do this better. Built Castmagic is an AI tool that allowed them to create their titles, their show notes, their timestamps, their LinkedIn posts, their blog, their newsletter. All this stuff is done automatically for you with the recording you've got. And then Castmagic is expanded from there. So we realized, once again, you're not just a podcaster. You do so much more. So we've got spaces for coaches, for courses. I can literally take a podcast with a prompt, turn it into a course, go to a PowerPoint or Canva, build that course, deliver my masterclass, record that masterclass, come into Castmagic, use the course profile and turn it into a worksheet, turn it into a quiz, turn it into all these handouts that I can give to people. So it goes far beyond just podcasting. Once again, the power of AI to how do we extract knowledge from conversations? And that's really what we're focused on.
Dude, I love that. I love, that's rad how it happened for you, how you got involved and that you saw like the early versions and to what it's become now. I mean, as we speak, just for people listening and watching, I'm on the website, just scrolling through some of the stuff. I think it's great. Like I mentioned, my girl on my team, Carolyn, she uses it. And so is this mostly for agency owners, independent podcasters, or more or less everyone?
So I know the core of your audience here were podcasters, but this is why we said podcasters aren't just podcasters. Like you are doing everything. So the core is everyone. I've got agencies that are using it, like probably Carolyn or Carolyn, right?
Carolyn.
Carolyn on your team, like she's probably running multiple shows through it. I've got individual podcasters who they're like, great, I'm in the real estate market. So they're using it for their real estate or their finance podcast, but then they're also using the sales discovery function of it. And then they're using courses because they create courses and like everyone's thinking about how do we monetize? Going back to what I said, monetization doesn't have to be just downloads for your podcast. What is your business? What is your brand? Who are you and what you're trying to do? How do you write a book? So you can use Castmagic to help you start organizing these pieces of conversations and thoughts and start the framework of your book. Or like I said, I made it the framework for my course. So it really becomes like your media agency. So solopreneurs are loving it because they're like, I don't have the time, as you know, to do all the things you need to do. So how do we let AI now start helping me in that regards? And now I can edit and do more than what I could before.
Yeah, having all that available, I think, is game changing. Like you said, for solo people, and then hobbyists, professionals. It kind of runs the gamut, and I think that's cool. It's just wild to me what you can do with AI, and it feels like it happens so fast.
100%.
Is there anything that you could talk about that's coming up for Castmagic, or not talk about, or give us a hint? Is there anything in development?
Yeah, I mean, look, for those that are listening here, right? So Castmagic, take your podcast, you load it in there. It's going to create a great transcription for you. That's what we pride ourselves on, North Star. Once again, I don't have the time to make the edit. It's going to then, out of the box, create all this AI content that we already know you're going to need. Then there's a section that you can automate, like ChatGPT prompts in there. And then we just released a studio function. So now you can start creating quote cards and audiograms and image overlays. So getting into the visual components of it, not to compete with some of the tools that are out there, but just to have you create a workspace that everyone can live inside there. And I think that's going to be a game changer. I know I use those functions because I'm like, all right, I need AI image generated with my quotes. So how do I help and accomplish that? So I think for your podcasters that are listening here, not only do I urge you to test it out if you haven't, but also think about it, once again, outside of the box. Don't just think of your narrow focus of just podcasting. Castmagic does so much more than just podcasting. I take memos. We have an iOS app. I will literally take my voice memos, take a 2-minute thought I had while I'm walking the dog and turn that into 10 pieces of content that I'm able to leverage. I take coaching calls and I turn that into a course. Like, there's just so many conversations you're having. How do we start repurposing them? And I think of repurposing as two ways, whether it's extracting knowledge or it's turning into an asset that you're going to leverage.
Yeah, the repurposing piece is huge. I mean, that's a lot of what I use AI for. Do you use it in some of your LinkedIn stuff? Is that part of your workflow for that? Because if you guys don't know, definitely follow Greg on LinkedIn. He's super active on there, posting a lot of interesting thoughts about podcasting and networking, and also sharing different podcasts. So tell me a little bit about that, because that's something I've noticed too. And so I didn't know it was every Monday, although I have seen it multiple times. So tell me about that. And is that just to like a community thing to like introduce people to new shows? Tell me, how did that start and what shows do you pick?
So I guess I'm trying to remember how it started. I think the way it started is I was working for, PlayerFM at the time. And I'm like, all right, I'm diving deep into these podcasts. I'm talking to podcasters all day long. And I'm like, all right, well, let's start eating the food that's being fed to me. So let's start listening to shows. And then you start realizing like what's good, what's not. And you start gaining an understanding there. And then I stare at a computer 11 hours a day. And I'm like, all right, think about what most of us do. We stare at a computer all day. Then for me, I go work out. Then I sit on the couch and I watch TV. My eyes, I'm like, oh my God, I can't see anymore. But the joys of a podcast is I can listen to a podcast, lay down on the couch, right? Maybe you fall asleep. I'm not going to. But like, I'll listen to a podcast and go give my eyes, and that's literally my LinkedIn post. Give your eyes a rest, take a break from the screen, keep feeding your brain, and listen to something good. And then you can go down sci-fi, you can go fiction, you can get that's the joys of podcast. It can be anything you want. Your mind can allow you to either consume content in educational way, you can make it a narrative, whatever you're looking for. And that's really where it was. I'm like, all right, I'm listening to all these podcasts. Let me start recommending some. And let me try and engage people to take a break from their daily lives of TV.
Yeah, getting away from the screen.
Yeah.
I'm big on that too. I am a big consume podcast like via audio. And you just kind of mentioned that you do that too. So this is like a two-parter. One, what's your favorite app to listen on? And then two, where do you fall on the video podcast spectrum? Do you consume any video podcasts? Do you think podcasters need to have a video component? Would love to hear your thoughts on that. There's no wrong answer. I'm just curious because everyone's got a different approach, because this will be video, and I do put out video, but I was very reluctant. It's a lot more work. So yeah, what app do you mostly listen on? And give me some thoughts on video.
So I was literally just talking about this with, shout out to Daniel Lewis, Hall of Fame podcaster here. I was just talking about this with him because he's testing out some podcast listening platforms. And I'm like, what I really need in my podcast listening platform is the ability to have spaces. And so I could have one for my business, one for this, one for that, as opposed to everything all in one place. One thing that I enjoyed, and I worked there, one thing I enjoyed about PlayerFM is the ability to categorize and have my different folders of spaces. So I still use PlayerFM, but I don't have any ties to it now that I'm no longer there. So
I never even heard of that. Like breaking up like playlist, almost like playlist kind of. Or
I can have a playlist tied to business, playlist tied to comedy. So I'm like, what am I in the mood for right now? I want a self-help one. So instead of scrolling through your whole feed on Apple or Spotify, you're like, let me just put this into a category, a folder, and go like, these are my go-to self-help ones, like as an example. So that is the way I look at that.
Player FM, wow, good for you. That's a rarity. No, that's cool. I'm basic. I listen on Apple, but that's interesting.
And so for your audience here, that's a good thing to think about. Going back to the three questions, how do I grow my audience? How do I grow my distribution? And how do I monetize? Most people who have a podcast, they're only thinking of the top 5, which is about 70% of your market in terms of listens. But if you have someone like me, which is another 30% of the people not using those 5, the unique piece is that means I sought out an app. I sought out a platform that gave me what I needed. So most likely, I listen to far more podcasts than the average person because I literally found something to give me what I wasn't getting from your general Spotify or Apple. So if you're missing out on those 30%, those are your hardcore listeners in that regards. You're actually in the game and you just use Apple, but like, hey, maybe you didn't realize like you don't know what you don't know. And those 30% of us who knew something to figure out like, this is what I'm looking for, this is a cool feature, then we go out there. So I highly recommend for your podcast listeners, double check your hosting company. And if you're not part of all the listening platforms, it's free. Take the time, get your show everywhere, and start reaching other people they may not. Because as I always sold at PlayerFM, we had 2 million people. We're not the largest show, our largest platform. But you could be a big show in a small pond, And then you can start ranking, and that helps you organic. And then you can start saying, like, we're the top 5, sewing podcast on Player FM. No one cares what Player FM is. You're just able to say we're a top 5 something.
Yeah.
That's always a cool little advertising thing for you.
Yeah.
Everyone's so focused on, I'm charting on Apple, I'm charting on Spotify. Do people really, like, most of us are skeptic, like, fine, you're charting as a top here on Spotify. Like, I'm an indie. Am I ever going to be there? Maybe not. But hey, if I'm on this third-party platform that's got a smaller audience, but I'm actually doing really well, and they're dedicated listeners, that's good to know. So I would say that is the first part of your answer. Long-winded.
Sure.
Second part of your answer, it goes back to just Castmagic and everything else I keep saying. Content repurposing. Put your camera in there. It's easy. Put your audio and strip it out there. Create your blog, create your newsletter. The way I look at it is education. And what I mean by that is people learn different ways. Personally, I listen, I don't watch. Goes back to the whole thing. I don't want to be sitting in front of a screen and consuming more content when I'm already staring at a screen. So let me just take a break and listen. Other people, I know they watch it, but I definitely say do both. It doesn't cost you much to have both. You also are able to reach a different audience. The person who likes to watch it on YouTube versus the person who's going to listen on Spotify. Or I will never listen or watch either, but give me your newsletter. I say this all the time. There's a guy, he sends out a newsletter every Thursday. I never listen to his podcast. I texted him like last week for his birthday. He knows I don't listen to his podcast. But you know what? I wait every morning for his newsletter on Thursday. And what does that mean? I'm always thinking of him. He's top of mind. I'm engaging with his brand. Does it matter that he's not getting downloads? No, because I'm thinking of him. I'm referring business to him, or I'm reaching out to him. Like, that's all you want. You want that engagement. You want the conversation. It doesn't matter if it's in your podcasts or if it's on a YouTube channel. You just want to make sure you've got your audience there. So that's my take on the second part of your question.
Yeah, I'm similar. I mean, I do watch a little bit here and there, but I'm mainly in audio. My background's even before podcasting and audio engineering, so I love that. I love putting on the headphones and just kind of escaping. But I agree. If you're doing the repurposing and you're using a tool like Castmagic or a similar tool, it should be fair. It's still work, but to get the blog out, the video out, all socials out, and I think that's important as well. But Greg, as we're rounding home here, give our audience one podcast that you think they should check out. Could be any genre. What are you listening to that you recommend someone check out?
So I'll be biased on this one because I just went to their second season live taping here in LA in a studio. The show's called Table Reads, Table Read, no S. And it's an incredible concept. I've always been skeptic of listening to podcasts that are fiction, that are like a narrative. I'm like, I want the education.
I never have. Yeah, I never have. I'm not against it. I just never have. Yeah.
And I will say, Table Read has done an incredible job. Imagine taking a Hollywood script and creating a table read. So imagine you've got 20 people sitting there. They're all doing the voices. They're reading through it. They've got a narrator. But then they produce it and they add the effects and the sounds and so forth. So you can actually visualize what this would look like at a show or as a movie because it's there. You can follow along because the narrator is literally telling you who's who and what's going on. I'm really stoked for the second season, but each episode is its own little story. And I highly recommend just diving into one that fits your goal. I listened to Love and Darkness, which was like a World War II story. And you're like, I could see this as a movie. Like, I would sit in a theater to watch this. It was incredible. So that's the one I would recommend.
Yeah, that sounds fun, dude. I will check that out. We'll link to it in the show notes. And then, Greg, one final question. When are you launching your podcast? Have you ever thought about that? Is there any? It's got to be, whether you do it or not, there has to have been something stewing a little bit.
So the joy of this is, first off, I've wanted to go down the guesting piece. Let's start learning what it's like to be a guest, but also learn from host. Goes back to what I tell podcasters. Start doing your research. Too many people don't listen to other people's podcasts, and they're like, what do you like about these other people's shows? What don't you like about it? How do you incorporate it into your own? So being a guest, I start seeing that. But also you get to start seeing what is the process that hosts go through. Good example is I work for a company where you could automate all the content for me as a guest because most hosts struggle getting their guests to post. Why? Because you don't give us much to do. They're like, hey, here's your link, it's live. You can literally use a tool like Castmagic, automate my blog, my newsletter, and everything else. Whether I liked it or not, you at least gave me a starting point. And there's a function within inside Castmagic that I can go ahead and I can create it if I didn't like it. So I'm learning all the different tricks and tips and tricks. It wasn't until about maybe a month ago that I thought of what the topic of my podcast would be when I started. And so, yeah, I think by the end of the year, I'll probably go down that path. But
It's something brewing.
It's something brewing.
Cool. I love that. And I love the guesting piece and listening to other shows. It's funny. I've stolen a couple things from actually a couple of the shows that I work on and kind of the way that they do and the way they lead in. And of course, I'm still a work in progress, but it's totally true because I have, studied a little bit of some people and tried to implement some stuff. It's kind of like with music too. I've been a musician all my life, and you start out all your influences and you learn, you kind of copy it first, then you tweak and try to make it your own. So I think that's a good piece of advice, for as a guest and as a host, to pick up on the relationship between the two. Greg, what's one piece of advice that you would give to podcasters if you kind of had to narrow something down for what you're thinking about lately?
I'm big on breaking the fourth wall. I think that it's a skill, but it's also something most of us don't do in the podcasting space. And for those of you that most don't know what the breaking the fourth wall, but they know it, they don't know by term. I guess living out in Hollywood, I kind of always think about that, right? So breaking the fourth wall is engaging your audience real time. And you've done it a couple times during our conversation here where it's like, hey, for our audience, but one person who does a really good job that I think that I try to model or I tell others to model is like someone like Mel Robbins. And so she does a great job because she was like, hold on, everyone, community, let's just stop here and take a moment and realize, what did Greg just say? And the nice thing about that from my standpoint is, as an audience member, it's not just a fly on the wall. You're bringing me in. You've broken that fourth wall and you're like bringing me into that conversation. The other thing I love about that is it gives me a moment to process it. She's literally processing what's being said right now, the therapy session they're having, but she's then giving me as an audience member a moment to go like, you're right, I did. As opposed to 45 minutes, everything was really great, and you just kept talking. I'm like, how do I even process what you guys just said? So breaking the fourth wall, the examples I always like to give is Deadpool, if anyone knows the movie Deadpool, or Ferris Bueller's Day Off. Like, he talks to the audience. He stops and he starts talking to you as if like you're there. That is breaking the fourth wall. It's a theater term. I'm not a theater person, but I just love that.
Yeah, no, I like that too. I think, it just gives people a minute to slow down and you can kind of process it and bring the audience in. And it kind of makes I try to do it, I guess, as like a teachable thing. So if you had to tell our audience this or show somebody this or that. But
then you go beyond that. So then you go beyond that. It's like, hey, teach our audience this. You're bringing them in, but it's still more of you and I teaching the audience and going like, hey, if you're listening, here's the advice. The breaking the fourth wall would be even more going like, all right, I taught you something, like, hold on, everyone, let's just process what Greg just said. So it's actually doing it in reverse, going like, oh, you just gave me a teachable moment, recognizing the teachable moment, going like, hey, everyone, that was a moment we should all just process. Kind of, it's a reverse moment.
Did love that advice. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, that's also the joys of guesting a lot, where you're like, all right, I listen to a lot of shows. I see what is being done. You take the tips and tricks and then you share them. And that's why the joy is we're all still learning. We're all still trying to hone our craft. And if we never stop, that's why everyone goes to podcast movement or podcast events. Like, you've got the experts there, but they're all still picking up things. I'm sure there's plenty that everyone can still keep learning from each other.
Greg, want to thank you for coming on the show. Guys, Greg and I will both be at Podcast Movement Evolutions in LA. So if you're there, hit both of us up. Would love to hang out and chat. And Greg, if people want to learn more about you, where can they find you? What's the best place to get in touch?
I mean, we've talked about it. I live on LinkedIn. So Greg Wasserman on LinkedIn. That's where I'm at. Add me. Follow the content. I love engaging. And then if you end up joining Castmagic, I'll see you in our Slack community, because we didn't talk about it, but I'm head of partnerships and community for Castmagic, so I'm always helping people out in that regards.
Perfect. Well, Greg, thank you for being on the show.
Hey, pleasure. Thanks so much, Eric, and I'll look forward to finally meeting you in person in a few weeks.
Yeah, pumped, man. It's coming up.